May 10, 1869. Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. Two trains face each other on newly laid tracks. Between them, a crowd of men in suits and work clothes gather around a single wooden railroad tie. They're about to drive in the final spike, a golden spike, that will connect the railroads from the East Coast to the West Coast. For the first time in history, you can travel by train all the way across America. A photographer sets up his camera. The men crowd in close. They smile. They wave their hats. Some hold champagne bottles. This is a celebration, a triumph, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the greatest engineering projects in human history. The photograph is taken. It becomes famous, one of the most iconic images in American history. It shows the moment America was finally connected, coast to coast. But here's what the photograph doesn't show. The thousands of Chinese workers who built most of the railroad, the men who blasted through mountains, who laid track across deserts, who worked in freezing winters and blazing summers, who died by the hundreds, maybe more than 1,000, and were buried in unmarked graves along the tracks. In that famous golden spike photograph, there are about 200 people visible: engineers, businessmen, railroad officials. A few laborers, not a single Chinese face. The Chinese workers, who made up 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce, were not invited to the celebration. They were told to move their camps away from Promontory Summit before the ceremony, get out of sight, make the photograph look better, cleaner, more American. So they did. They packed up their tents and cooking equipment and tools. They moved down the line, out of frame, out of history, and for the next 150 years, most Americans didn't even know they existed. This is the story of those workers. The men who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, the men who died building it, and the men who were erased from the story entirely. Before we begin, I want you to think about something. If you could step back in time to the Transcontinental Railroad at any moment, when would it be? Would you choose the Golden Spike ceremony in 1869, when everyone celebrated? Would you go to a day in 1867, when Chinese workers were blasting tunnels through solid granite in the Sierra Nevada mountains? Or would you pick a cold winter night in 1866, when workers huddled in camps, knowing that tomorrow some of them might not survive? Drop your answer in the comments, because where you choose to look tells you what kind of story you think this is. If you want to hear the real history, the kind that includes everyone who built America, not just the people who got their picture taken, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. These stories only survive when we refuse to let them be forgotten. Let's begin. The United States is about to fall apart. Southern states are threatening to leave the Union. War is coming. The country that's barely held together might break completely. In the middle of this chaos, some people are dreaming about a railroad, not just any railroad, a railroad that would stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, a railroad that would connect California to the rest of the country, a railroad that would make it possible to travel across the entire continent in days instead of months. It sounds impossible. The distance is about 19 miles. The route would have to cross the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains, deserts, rivers, and Native American territories. No one had ever built anything like it, but a small group of businessmen believed it could be done. More importantly, they believed they could make a lot of money doing it. The main players were four men in California, called the Big Four. Their names were Leland Stanford, Collies Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They were merchants and investors, not railroad men, not engineers, just businessmen who saw an opportunity. On the East Coast, another company, the Union Pacific, would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific, controlled by the Big Four, would build eastward from Sacramento, California. Whoever laid the most track would get the most money and land from the government. It was a race. The U.S. government wanted this railroad badly, so badly that they offered huge incentives. For every mile of track laid, the railroad companies would get loans, between $16,000 and $48,000 per mile, depending on how difficult the terrain was. They would also get land grants, free land on both sides of the tracks, millions of acres, land they could sell to settlers for pure profit. The Civil War started in 1861. But even during the war, President Abraham Lincoln pushed for the railroad. In 1862, he signed the Pacific Railroad Act. Construction could begin. The Union Pacific started building in 1865, after the war ended. They had it easier. The land from Omaha heading west was mostly flat plains. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. The Central Pacific had a much bigger problem. Just 50 miles east of Sacramento, the Sierra Nevada mountains rose up. Massive granite peaks, some as high as 7,000 feet. To get across, the railroad would need to blast 15 tunnels through solid rock. The longest tunnel would be 1,659 feet, cutting straight through the heart of a mountain. No one knew if it was even possible. Chinese workers would find out, with their lives. The Central Pacific Railroad has a serious problem. They can't find enough workers. The railroad needs thousands of men to lay track, to grade the land, to blast tunnels, to build bridges. Hard, dangerous work. And in California, most white men don't want to do it. California in 1865 is still caught up in gold rush fever. Even though the gold rush peaked in 1849, men are still hoping to strike it rich. Why would you take a job laying railroad track for $30 a month when you could dig for gold and maybe become a millionaire? The Central Pacific tries everything. They hire Irish immigrants. They hire Civil War veterans. They try to recruit workers from the East Coast. Nothing works. Men sign up, work for a few weeks, then leave to try their luck in the gold fields. Charles Crocker, the man in charge of construction, is desperate. Then someone makes a suggestion. What about Chinese workers? Crocker is skeptical. The Chinese men in California are small. Most weigh less than 120 pounds. How could they do heavy railroad work? But he's running out of options. He decides to try a test. He hires 50 Chinese workers. The Chinese workers prove him wrong immediately. They work faster than the white crews. They work longer hours. They don't complain. They don't get drunk on Saturday nights and miss work on Monday. They don't quit to go look for gold. Crocker wants more, many more. Here's where the story gets complicated. Most Chinese workers in California came from Guangdong province in southern China. They came because China was suffering. War, famine, poverty. Stories spread that in America, Gamsan, Gold Mountain, there was work, there was money, there was a chance for a better life. The Chinese workers who came to California were mostly young men. They came alone, leaving their families behind. The plan was simple: work in America for a few years, save money, send it home, then return to China. Most of them never expected to stay permanently. By 1865, there were thousands of Chinese men in California. Some had worked in the gold mines, some ran laundries or restaurants, some worked on farms. When the railroad started recruiting, thousands signed up. The Central Pacific eventually hired more than 12,000 Chinese workers. At the peak of construction, Chinese laborers made up about 90% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce. 90%. Without them, the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad would never have been built. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. The railroad company admitted it themselves in their own reports. But here's the catch: Chinese workers were paid less than white workers, a lot less. White workers on the railroad earned about $35 per month, plus food and housing provided by the company. Chinese workers earned about $26 per month, and they had to pay for their own food. They had to pay for their own housing. They had to buy their own tools and equipment. So a Chinese worker doing the exact same job as a white worker earned about two-thirds the pay and had to cover his own expenses. Why did the Chinese workers accept this? Because $26 a month in America was more than they could earn in China, because they needed to send money home to their families, because they had no choice. And the railroad company knew all of this. They knew the workers were desperate, so they paid them as little as possible. That's called exploitation, using someone's desperation to make them accept unfair treatment. The Chinese workers knew it was unfair. In 1867, about 3,000 of them went on strike. They demanded equal pay with white workers. They demanded better working conditions. They demanded respect. The railroad company responded by cutting off their food supply. The workers were camped high in the mountains. There was nowhere to buy food, no way to grow it. After a week of starvation, the strike collapsed. The workers went back to work. At the same low wages. That's the reality behind the triumph of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was built on cheap labor, exploited labor, desperate men who had no other choice. The real work begins, the impossible work, the work that will kill hundreds of men. The Sierra Nevada mountains stand in the way. 15 tunnels need to be carved through solid granite. The longest summit tunnel cuts straight through the spine of the mountains at an elevation of 7,000 feet. In 1866, there are no power tools, no dynamite yet, that comes later, no machines to drill through rock. Everything has to be done by hand. Here's how it works. A Chinese worker climbs up to the tunnel face. He holds a drill, a long iron rod with a sharp point. His partner swings a sledgehammer. Bang, bang, bang. Slowly, inch by inch, they drill a hole into the solid granite. It takes hours to drill one hole, sometimes a whole day. Then they drill another hole next to it, and another, until they have a pattern of holes drilled into the rock face. Then comes the dangerous part. Black powder, gunpowder, is packed into the holes. A fuse is lit. Everyone runs. The explosion blasts out chunks of rock. If you're lucky, the blast clears a few feet of tunnel. If you're unlucky, the explosion comes too soon, or the rock collapses wrong, or something goes wrong and someone dies. Then the workers go back in. They clear away the broken rock. They shore up the tunnel walls with timber to keep them from collapsing, and they start drilling again. Progress is measured in inches per day, sometimes just a few inches. For the big tunnels, it takes months and months to get through. Summit Tunnel, the longest and most difficult, takes more than a year. From May 1866 to August 1867, 15 months of drilling, blasting, hauling rock, working in shifts 24 hours a day. Thousands of Chinese workers rotating through, hammering away at solid granite. And this is all happening at 7,000 feet elevation. The air is thin, it's hard to breathe. Winters are brutal. Snow piles up 20, 30, even 40 feet deep. Temperatures drop below zero. The Chinese workers live in camps near the tunnels, simple wooden shacks or tents, no real heat, no insulation. They sleep in bunches, crowding together for warmth, and they keep working, even in winter, even in blizzards, because the railroad company demands it. The race is on. Every day of delay costs money. So the workers keep drilling, keep blasting, keep hauling rock, in snowstorms, in freezing cold, in conditions that should have stopped all work. How many died? We don't know exactly. The company didn't keep careful records. Or if they did, those records were destroyed or lost. Estimates range from 1,200 to 2,000 Chinese workers dying during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Most of them died in the mountains. In the tunnels, in the snow, some died from explosions. Black powder was unpredictable. Sometimes a charge would go off too early. Sometimes the fuse would burn faster than expected. Workers standing too close would be killed instantly. Some died from tunnel collapses. Even with timber shoring, the tunnels were unstable. Rocks fell, ceilings caved in, men were buried alive, some died from avalanches. When winter snowstorms hit the Sierra Nevada, avalanches were common. Entire camps could be swept away in seconds. Bodies wouldn't be found until spring when the snow melted. Some died from accidents with equipment, falling rocks, runaway carts, slips and falls. Some died from illness. Working in cold, wet conditions, living in crowded camps with poor sanitation, diseases spread fast, pneumonia, typhoid, dysentery, and some died from exhaustion, working 16-hour days, 7 days a week in brutal conditions. Men pushed past their limits until their bodies gave out. The bodies were buried along the railroad line, sometimes in marked graves, usually not, just holes dug beside the tracks, bodies wrapped in blankets or rice sacks. Buried quickly so work could continue. No funerals, no ceremonies, no markers, just dirt covering Chinese workers whose names no one bothered to write down. The railroad kept moving forward, inch by inch, tunnel by tunnel. Over the bodies of men who were never counted. Progress is too slow. The company is getting impatient. The tunnels through the Sierra Nevada are taking forever. Black powder isn't powerful enough. Drilling by hand takes too long. So the Central Pacific decides to try something new, something experimental, something incredibly dangerous. Nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is a liquid explosive. It's much more powerful than black powder. But it's also incredibly unstable. The slightest bump, the slightest heat, the wrong vibration, and it explodes. Accidentally, violently. Alfred Nobel, yes, the same Nobel who created the Nobel Prize, had just invented a way to make nitroglycerin slightly more stable. But it was still dangerous. So dangerous that many places banned it. Too many accidental explosions. Too many workers killed. The Central Pacific didn't care about the danger. They cared about speed. So they started using nitroglycerin in the tunnels. Chinese workers were the ones who handled it. They carried bottles of nitroglycerin up into the mountains, on foot, over rough trails. One slip, one stumble, and the bottle would explode, taking the worker with it. They poured the nitroglycerin into the drilled holes. Carefully, slowly. One wrong move and it could detonate right in their hands. They lit fuses and ran. Hoping they had enough time. Hoping the explosion would come when they expected it to. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the nitroglycerin exploded early, or unexpectedly, or for no reason at all. Workers died, in ones and twos. Sometimes in groups, blown apart by explosions that could be heard for miles. One account from 1867 describes a nitroglycerin accident that killed 5 Chinese workers instantly. The explosion was so powerful that pieces of rock were thrown hundreds of feet. The bodies were torn to fragments. That's a direct quote from the report. How many workers died from nitroglycerin accidents? Again, we don't know. The records either don't exist or were destroyed, but contemporary accounts mention explosions regularly, almost casually, like it was just expected, part of the job. The nitroglycerin did speed things up. Tunnels that would have taken months with black powder took weeks with nitroglycerin. The Summit Tunnel was finally completed in August 1867, more than a year of work. thousands of workers, hundreds dead. The railroad company celebrated. The obstacle was overcome. They could keep building. The bodies were buried in the mountains, in unmarked graves. No one recorded their names. No one told their families back in China what happened. The men just disappeared and the railroad moved on. The mountains are behind them. Now comes the desert. After finally getting through the Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific tracks head east across Nevada. Flat land. No more tunnels. No more avalanches. But different dangers, different deaths. The Nevada desert is brutal. In summer, temperatures climb above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes 110 or higher. The sun beats down without mercy. There's almost no shade. No trees, just sagebrush and sand and rocks. Water is scarce. The railroad has to haul water in by the barrel. Workers get a ration each day. Not enough, but all there is. Chinese workers lay track in this heat. Lifting rails that weigh hundreds of pounds, hammering spikes, shoveling gravel, hour after hour, day after day. Men collapse from heat stroke, from dehydration. They're given a few minutes to recover, then expected to keep working. If they can't, they're fired, left in the desert, told to make their own way back to civilization. Some do, some don't, some die trying. In winter, the opposite problem. The desert gets cold, freezing cold. Workers are still living in tents, still wearing the same thin clothes, no real protection from the cold, and there's still the quota. The railroad companies, Central Pacific and Union Pacific, are racing each other. The government pays by the mile. More miles means more money. So the workers are pushed to lay as much track as possible, as fast as possible. The Central Pacific's Chinese crews become famous for their speed. They lay track faster than anyone thought possible. On April 28, 1869, they lay 10 miles of track in a single day. 10 miles. That's a record that stands for decades. But that record has a cost. Men working until they collapse. No breaks, no rest. Just relentless forward movement. More workers die, from exhaustion, from accidents, from the desert itself. Again, no exact count. The company doesn't care enough to keep track. Chinese workers are seen as expendable. If one dies, hire another. China has millions of people. There are always more workers. That was the attitude. That was the reality. The railroad keeps advancing, mile by mile, across Nevada, into Utah. Getting closer and closer to where the Union Pacific is building from the east. The finish line is in sight. The two railroads will meet. The continent will be connected, and thousands of Chinese workers will be written out of the story. May 10, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. The two railroads meet. The last rail is laid. The final spike, a golden spike made specially for this ceremony, is ready to be driven in. Telegraph lines are set up so the whole nation can follow along. When the spike is hammered in, a signal will be sent. Bells will ring in cities across America. Cannons will fire. Everyone will celebrate. At Promontory Summit, a crowd gathers. Railroad officials, engineers, businessmen, reporters, a photographer. The Chinese workers who laid most of the track, not invited. They're told to move their camps away from the ceremony site. To get out of sight, some accounts say they were specifically ordered to make themselves scarce. So they do, they pack up, they move down the line, they watch from a distance if they watch at all. The ceremony begins, speeches. Long speeches about American greatness, about manifest destiny, the idea that America was meant to stretch from coast to coast, about progress and civilization. No one mentions the Chinese workers, not once. Not in any of the speeches, they're invisible. Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four, is given the honor of driving in the golden spike. He swings the hammer, he misses, hits the rail instead of the spike. Telegraph operators pretend he hit it and send the signal anyway. The photographer takes the famous picture. Two locomotives facing each other, crowds of men in dark suits and work clothes, champagne bottles raised. Everyone celebrating, not one Chinese face visible in the photograph. Out of the 200 people in the picture, all of them appear to be white. The photograph goes out to newspapers across the country. It becomes iconic. The moment America was united, coast to coast. But it's a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. The photograph shows the ceremony. It doesn't show who actually built the railroad. 90% of the Central Pacific workforce was Chinese, 90%. Without those workers, the western half of the railroad doesn't exist. The Golden Spike ceremony doesn't happen. The coast-to-coast connection doesn't happen. But they're not in the picture. They're not mentioned in the speeches. They're not acknowledged. They're not thanked. They're erased. After the ceremony, most of the Chinese workers are fired. Their jobs are done. The railroad doesn't need them anymore. They're given their final pay and told to leave. Some find other work, building more railroads, working in mines, opening restaurants or laundries in growing western towns. Some try to return to China. Some succeed. Some die trying to earn enough money for passage home. And the ones who died building the railroad, they stay in the ground, in unmarked graves, scattered across California, Nevada, and Utah. No one knows exactly where. No one marked the graves, no one recorded the names. For 150 years, most Americans don't know they existed. The Transcontinental Railroad is taught as a triumph of American engineering, a symbol of progress. A great achievement. The Chinese workers who made it possible are a footnote, if they're mentioned at all. That erasure was deliberate, and it worked. For a century and a half, the story of the Transcontinental Railroad left out the people who built it. But history has a way of coming back. The truth has a way of being discovered, even when people try very hard to bury it. The railroad is finished, the ceremony is over, the golden spike is driven, and now thousands of Chinese workers need to find new jobs. Some stay with the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad still needs maintenance. Tracks need repair. Bridges need upkeep. Tunnels need clearing after rock slides. Some Chinese workers become section hands, workers who maintain specific sections of the railroad. The pay is low. The work is hard, but it's steady. Others move to cities. San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, they open businesses. Laundries mostly, restaurants, small shops. They form communities, Chinatowns, places where they can speak their own language, eat their own food, be with people who understand them. Still others head to new railroad projects. There are more railroads being built across the West, the Northern Pacific, the Southern Pacific. All of them need workers. All of them hire Chinese laborers. For the same reason the Central Pacific did. They work hard, they work cheap, they don't complain. But something is changing in America, something dark. As more Chinese immigrants arrive in California and other Western states, white workers start to resent them. They blame Chinese workers for taking jobs, for driving down wages. Never mind that the Chinese workers are paid less precisely because white employers want cheap labor. Never mind that the problem is greedy companies, not desperate workers. The blame falls on the Chinese anyway. In the 1870s, anti-Chinese violence starts. Riots, attacks, Chinese neighborhoods burned. Chinese workers beaten in the streets, murdered. In 1871, in Los Angeles, a white mob kills 18 Chinese people. It's called the Chinese Massacre of 1871. No one is seriously punished. In 1885, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, white miners attack Chinese workers. 28 Chinese people are killed, 15 are wounded, hundreds are driven out of town, their homes are burned. These aren't isolated incidents. They happen in towns and cities across the West. Chinese workers are targeted, blamed, attacked, killed, and the law doesn't protect them. The legal system in most Western states doesn't allow Chinese people to testify against white people in court. So even when there are witnesses, even when everyone knows who committed the crimes, Chinese victims can't get justice. The federal government watches this happen and decides to make it worse. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's the first time in American history that the government bans immigration based on race and nationality. The law makes it illegal for Chinese laborers to come to America. Chinese people already in America can't become citizens, can't bring their families, can't vote, can't own land in many states. The law is supposed to be temporary. 10 years, but it gets renewed and renewed again. It stays in effect for 61 years, until 1943. Think about what this means. The Chinese workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, who made one of America's greatest achievements possible, are now banned from the country. Told they're not welcome, told they don't belong. The workers who helped build America are excluded from America. The irony is bitter and cruel. Many Chinese workers who plan to save money and return to China find themselves trapped. They can't bring their families to America, but they also can't afford to go home, so they stay, alone, working low-wage jobs in cities where they're hated and attacked. They grow old in America, alone, far from their families, never seeing their children grow up, never holding their grandchildren. Some die in America, buried in Chinese cemeteries. Many of their bodies are later exhumed and sent back to China, because even in death they want to go home. This is the legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad for Chinese workers. Not celebration, not gratitude, but exclusion, violence, erasure. Here's something important to understand. We don't know exactly how many Chinese workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. We have estimates, between 1,200 and 2,000, maybe more, but we don't have exact numbers. We don't have names. We don't have lists. Why not? Because the Central Pacific Railroad Company didn't keep careful records of Chinese workers, or if they did, those records were destroyed. Some historians think the destruction was deliberate. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in America. The railroad company didn't want to be associated with employing so many Chinese workers, so they destroyed the evidence. Other historians think it was just neglect. Chinese workers weren't considered important enough to keep records about. When they died, their deaths weren't recorded. When they were hired or fired, no one bothered to write it down. Either way, the result is the same. We've lost the information. We know that white workers were counted carefully. The railroad kept payroll records, lists of names, records of who was hired and who was fired. When someone died, it was noted. But for Chinese workers, almost nothing. We have some general numbers from company reports. Approximately 10,000 Chinese workers employed, things like that, but no individual names, no personal records. There are a few exceptions. A handful of documents survived, some payroll records that mention Chinese labor as a category, some accident reports that say Chinese worker killed in explosion without giving a name. That's it. That's all that's left. Think about what this means. More than 12,000 Chinese workers helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. We can't name even 1% of them. We don't know their stories. We don't know where they came from. We don't know what happened to them. They're ghosts, present in the physical structure they built. The railroad still uses parts of their original route, but absent from the historical record. And the ones who died, even more anonymous. We don't know where they're buried. We don't know their names. We don't know how old they were, whether they had families, whether anyone back in China is still wondering what happened to them. Some bodies were probably sent back to China. There were organizations, Chinese benevolent associations, that tried to collect the bodies of Chinese workers who died and send them home for proper burial. But they didn't have the resources to find everyone, especially workers who died in remote mountain tunnels or desert camps. So hundreds, maybe more than 1,000, Chinese workers remain buried along the railroad line, in unmarked graves, in forgotten places. No headstones, no markers. Nothing. When you ride a train through the Sierra Nevada today, you're traveling over their graves. You're riding on tracks they laid, through tunnels they blasted, across bridges they built, but there's nothing to tell you they were there. Nothing to tell you what they did, nothing to tell you what it cost them. They built one of America's greatest achievements, and America forgot they existed. Let's talk about something we haven't mentioned yet, the families. Most Chinese workers who came to America were young men. Many of them were married, many had children, but immigration laws and poverty meant they couldn't bring their families with them, so they came alone, with a plan, work for a few years. Save money, send it home, then return to China. That was the dream. For the workers who died on the railroad, the dream ended in a tunnel in the Sierra Nevada, or in the Nevada desert, or under an avalanche. What happened to their families? Most of them probably never found out exactly what happened. Maybe they stopped receiving money. Maybe months went by with no letters. Maybe eventually someone from the same village who worked on the railroad came home and said, "I heard he died." In an explosion, I think, or maybe an avalanche, I'm not sure. That's it. That's all they would know. No official notification, no death certificate, no body sent home, no compensation from the railroad company, nothing. The family would go from waiting for money to come from America to realizing no more money would ever come. The husband, the son, the brother, gone, disappeared into America, into Gold Mountain, into the railroad. Wives became widows. Children grew up without fathers, parents lost sons, and they had no way to even visit a grave, no way to perform proper funeral rites. In Chinese culture, ancestor worship is important, honoring the dead. But how do you honor someone whose body is buried in an unmarked grave on the other side of the world? Some families saved money for years to send someone to America to try to find out what happened, to try to find the grave, to try to bring the body home. Most couldn't afford it. Most just lived with not knowing, with the uncertainty, with the grief that never got resolved. Think about this from their perspective. Your husband or father leaves for America. Says he'll be back in a few years. Rich, successful. He sends money for a while, then the money stops. Then silence. Nothing. Years pass. You don't know if he's dead or alive. You don't know if he abandoned you or died working. You don't know anything. That's the reality for hundreds, maybe thousands of Chinese families. Left behind. Left in limbo. Left to grieve without even knowing for certain what they were grieving. The railroad company didn't care. They had their railroad, that's all that mattered. The American government didn't care. Chinese workers were foreigners, temporary, not citizens, not real Americans. Their families in China, not America's problem. So the families were left to suffer alone, across an ocean, with no answers, no justice, no compensation. That suffering doesn't appear in the triumphant histories of the Transcontinental Railroad. It doesn't appear in the textbooks. It doesn't appear in the documentaries, but it's part of the story, an essential part, the human cost that gets forgotten. Let's go to the places where Chinese railroad workers are buried, or try to. The problem is we don't know where most of them are. Some were buried in established cemeteries, Chinese cemeteries in San Francisco, Sacramento, and other cities. workers who died in or near cities sometimes got proper burials. Their bodies were recovered, funeral rites were performed, graves were marked, but most workers died far from cities, in the mountains, in the desert, in remote camps along the railroad line. When someone died in a tunnel explosion, there wasn't time for a proper burial. The body, or what was left of it, was buried nearby, maybe in a clearing near the tunnel, maybe just beside the tracks. A hole was dug. The body was wrapped in whatever was available, a blanket, a piece of canvas, maybe nothing. The hole was filled in. No coffin, no marker, no ceremony, just a burial, quick and simple, so work could continue. When someone died in an avalanche, the body might not be recovered until spring. By then, it might be impossible to identify. The body would be buried wherever it was found. When someone died in a desert camp from heat stroke or illness, the burial would be a little more organized. The other workers would dig a grave, say some words, mark it with a pile of rocks or a wooden stake, but wooden stakes rot. Rock piles get scattered. After a few years, there's no trace the grave was ever there. After the railroad was finished, no one maintained these graves. No one kept records of where they were. The graves were simply forgotten. Over the years, roads were built, towns grew, development spread. Graves that were once in the middle of nowhere ended up under parking lots, highways, buildings. Some Chinese workers' remains were accidentally discovered during construction projects. Bones found when someone dug a foundation for a new building, or when a highway was being expanded, sometimes properly reburied, sometimes just discarded. Most graves were never found, never marked. The workers buried their remain anonymous. There are a few exceptions, a few places where Chinese workers' graves have been identified and protected. In 2014, archaeologists in Utah discovered what they believed were graves of Chinese railroad workers. They used ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation. They found evidence of burials, but no complete remains. The graves had been disturbed over the years. In some parts of the Sierra Nevada, hiking trails pass near areas where Chinese workers are known to have been buried. But there are no markers, no signs, nothing to tell hikers what they're walking past. This is the reality. More than 1,000 Chinese workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. Most of them are buried in unmarked, forgotten graves scattered across the American West. Their bodies are still there, beneath highways and towns and fields, their bones mixed with the soil of the country they helped build. But no one knows their names. No one knows exactly where they are. No one put up monuments. No one marked the graves. They're there, everywhere and nowhere, present but invisible, dead but not properly mourned. Lost in the landscape of America. For 150 years, American history textbooks barely mentioned Chinese railroad workers. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad was told like this. Brave American engineers and workers conquered the wilderness. They built a railroad across impossible terrain. They connected the nation. They built the future. Chinese workers, maybe a sentence. The Central Pacific also employed Chinese laborers. That's it. No mention of the 90% workforce. No mention of the tunnels they blasted. No mention of the avalanches. No mention of the deaths. Why the silence? Part of it was racism. Plain and simple. American history has always been told as the story of white people doing great things. People of color were background, footnotes, not the main characters. Part of it was the Chinese Exclusion Act. For 61 years, Chinese immigration was illegal. The country was officially saying, we don't want these people. So why would we celebrate them in our history books? Part of it was the destruction of records. Without documentation, it's easy to downplay the role Chinese workers played. We don't have proof of how many there were or what they did, so we'll just mention them briefly. And part of it was convenient forgetting. Americans wanted to celebrate the Transcontinental Railroad as a triumph. A source of national pride, acknowledging that it was built by exploited workers who were paid less, treated worse, and then excluded from the country. That complicates the story, makes it less triumphant, less proud. So the story was simplified, sanitized. The Chinese workers were edited out, and most Americans didn't know any better. If it's not in the textbooks, if it's not taught in schools, how would you know? The Chinese American community knew. They passed down the stories. Grandparents told grandchildren about ancestors who worked on the railroad, who died in the mountains, who were buried in unmarked graves. But for mainstream America, silence for generations. This silence had consequences. It allowed Americans to celebrate the railroad without reckoning with its costs, without acknowledging who really built it, without feeling any obligation to honor or remember the Chinese workers. It allowed the racism of the Chinese Exclusion Act to go unchallenged. If Chinese workers weren't important to American history, why should they be allowed in the country? It allowed the unmarked graves to remain unmarked. If no one remembers the workers existed, why mark their graves? The silence served a purpose. It made the story simpler, cleaner, more comfortable for white Americans. But it was a lie of omission, a lie told by leaving out the truth. And like all lies, eventually it started to crack. Things started to change in the 1960s and 1970s. The civil rights movement was making Americans reconsider their history, questioning whose stories were told and whose were left out, demanding that history include everyone, not just white people. Asian American activists started pushing for recognition of Chinese railroad workers. They organized events, gave lectures, published research, demanded that textbooks be changed. In 1969, exactly 100 years after the Golden Spike ceremony, Chinese American groups held their own ceremony at Promontory Summit. They drove in a symbolic spike. They honored their ancestors who built the railroad. It was the first time Chinese workers had been officially recognized at the site. 100 years late, slowly, things started to change. Textbooks began to include more information about Chinese railroad workers, not just a sentence but paragraphs, sometimes whole sections. Museums started creating exhibits. The California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento has a permanent exhibit about Chinese railroad workers. It includes artifacts, photographs, and stories. In 2014, the United States Department of Labor inducted Chinese railroad workers into the Labor Hall of Fame. Recognition, finally. In 2017, a grassroots organization called the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project was launched. Based at Stanford University, it's collecting research, oral histories, and documentation about Chinese railroad workers, trying to recover the lost history. They're using new technology, ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, archaeological techniques to try to find and identify graves. To give names back to the nameless. In 2019, 150 years after the Golden Spike, major commemorations were held at Promontory Summit. For the first time, Chinese railroad workers were front and center in the ceremony. Not erased, not forgotten, honored, a monument was unveiled. It shows Chinese railroad workers laying track. It lists their contributions. It acknowledges their sacrifice. It's small, it's late, but it's something. Communities along the railroad route are starting to put up markers, historical plaques that say, Chinese workers built this tunnel, Chinese workers laid this track, Chinese workers died here. Schools are teaching the fuller story. Students are learning about the Chinese contribution to the Transcontinental Railroad, not as a footnote, but as a central part of the narrative. The remembering has begun. Late, incomplete, but real. Still, huge gaps remain. We still don't know the names of most workers. We still don't know where most graves are. We still haven't fully reckoned with the exploitation and erasure. But the silence has been broken. The story is being told. The workers are being remembered. Finally, 150 years later. So what do we owe these workers? The Chinese railroad workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, who died by the hundreds, who were erased from history for 150 years. We owe them the truth. The truth is that the Transcontinental Railroad, one of America's greatest achievements, was built largely by Chinese workers. 90% of the Central Pacific workforce. The truth is that these workers were exploited, paid less than white workers, given more dangerous jobs, excluded from the celebration when the work was done. The truth is that more than 1,000 of them died, in tunnel explosions, in avalanches, from exhaustion and illness, and they were buried in unmarked graves that we've now lost. The truth is that after helping to build America, they were excluded from America. The Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration for 61 years. The workers who built the railroad were told they weren't welcome in the country they helped connect. We owe them this truth, all of it, the good and the bad, the achievement and the cost. We owe them remembrance. Their names should be in history books. Their stories should be taught in schools. Monuments should mark their graves, even if we don't know exactly where all the graves are. When you visit the Transcontinental Railroad route, you should see markers that say, Chinese workers built this, Chinese workers died here. When you learn about the Golden Spike ceremony, you should learn that the workers who built the railroad weren't invited to the celebration, that they were deliberately excluded from the photograph. We owe them acknowledgement. The United States government should formally acknowledge the role Chinese workers played in building the Transcontinental Railroad, acknowledge the exploitation, acknowledge the exclusion, acknowledge the erasure. Some people say, why does this matter? It happened 150 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. Why dig up the past? Here's why it matters. Because the past isn't really past. The Chinese Exclusion Act might have been repealed in 1943, but anti-Asian racism didn't end. It continues today. Hate crimes against Asian Americans, discrimination, exclusion. The erasure of Chinese railroad workers from American history is part of a larger pattern, a pattern of treating Asian Americans as foreigners, as not real Americans, even when their families have been here for generations. Even when their ancestors built the infrastructure of this country, remembering the Chinese railroad workers is a way of fighting back against that erasure, a way of saying, Asian Americans have always been part of this country. They built this country, they belong here, and it's a way of teaching an important lesson about American history, that our greatest achievements often come with costs we don't like to acknowledge. That progress is built on the backs of exploited workers, that the people who do the hardest, most dangerous work are often the ones who get the least credit. That's a lesson we still need to learn, because exploitation hasn't ended. Low-wage workers today, farm workers, construction workers, warehouse workers, delivery drivers, are still being underpaid and overworked, still taking risks that wealthier people don't have to take, still being treated as expendable. The story of the Chinese railroad workers is their story too, a story about how capitalism exploits desperate workers, how it values profits over people, how it erases the workers who make everything possible. Remembering the Chinese railroad workers is a way of honoring all workers, past and present, the people who build our world and are told they don't matter. They do matter, they've always mattered, and their stories deserve to be told. Let's end where we started, with absence, with erasure, with the things that aren't there. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, beneath rocks and soil and maybe a highway, lie the bones of Chinese workers who died blasting tunnels through granite. We don't know their names, we don't know exactly where they're buried, we don't know how many there are. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, beneath sand and sagebrush and maybe a parking lot, lie the bones of Chinese workers who died laying track across scorching wasteland. No markers, no graves, nothing. All along the route of the Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento to Promontory Summit are unnamed graves, forgotten graves, graves we've lost. The workers are still there. Their bones mixed with American soil. The railroad still runs over some of their graves. Trains still pass through tunnels they blasted with their hands and their lives, but we don't know where to put the flowers. We don't know where to stand in silence. We don't know how to honor them properly because we don't know where they are. That's the final injustice. Not just that they died, not just that they were exploited, not just that they were excluded from the celebration and from the country, but that they were buried and forgotten, lost, erased so completely that even when we want to remember them, even when we try to honor them, we can't find them. All we can do is tell their story, make sure people know they existed, make sure people know what they did, make sure people know what it cost them. This is that story. The Chinese railroad workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, who made one of America's greatest achievements possible, who died by the hundreds or thousands, who were paid less, treated worse, and then excluded from the country they helped build, who were erased from history for 150 years, who are finally, slowly being remembered. Their names are mostly lost, their graves are mostly lost, but their story doesn't have to be. We can tell it, we can teach it. We can make sure it's never forgotten again. That's what we owe them. That's the least we can do. Remember them, honor them, tell their story, so that 150 years from now, when people ride trains across America, they know who built the tracks beneath them. They know who blasted the tunnels they passed through. They know who paid the price for the connection we take for granted. The Chinese railroad workers, the workers who built America, and were erased from it. Until now, thank you for watching. If this story affected you, if it made you think or feel or see American history differently, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, share this video. These stories only survive when we refuse to let them be forgotten. The Chinese railroad workers were erased once. Let's make sure it never happens again. And drop a comment. What should we do to honor the Chinese railroad workers today? Should there be monuments at every tunnel they built? Should their names be researched and recorded? Should the graves be found and properly marked? What would justice look like 150 years later? Your thoughts matter, because remembering the past is how we change the future. See you in the next video.